Put your hands together for Allison Gacad, Senior Environmental Markets Correspondent, Carbon Pulse.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel today. We recognize, we got the kind of graveyard shift, but if you're here, we promise it's going to be a great discussion. I'll briefly introduce myself. So my name is Allison Gacad. I'm a correspondent at Carbon Pulse. Those of you who aren't aware, we cover carbon markets and climate policy. I lead the policy coverage in the Americas at Carbon Pulse. So that's anything from domestic emissions reductions policies or the absence of here in the US or in Canada. Rest in peace to our consumer price on carbon, consumer facing, but as well as on the international stage of international climate policy, which is why I suspect everyone's in the room today. We're gonna be talking Article 6. So I think before we get started, I wanna get a show of hands in terms of familiarity with Article 6 in the room. I think it'll be good to just kind of prep our panel here. So folks who are familiar with Article 6? Okay, that's good. I'm gonna one up one. Who feels confident about Article 6 and navigating? Okay, nice. We got some good expertise in the room. Today's panel, I'm quite excited. We were on a pre-panel call and I very quickly realized that across the three folks on stage, we have decades of carbon market expertise, but not just carbon market expertise, but the foundations of Article 6 and its intersections with the Paris Agreement. And I think it's best to just really jump right into things and facilitate the conversation. That's all I'm here for. I'm moderating the talk. I'm not the expert on stage. So let's start off with Rick Saines. Rick is the managing director at Pollination Law. And I think it'll be good to set the stage with what is Article 6, and we can get into 6.2 and 6.4 and go from there.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks for spending this hour with us. Great to be on the panel. I've spent a long time in this market. My first COP was COP 6 Biz, is what they called it. It was right after, it's kind of relevant to today's reality, is right after then President George W. Bush pulled the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol, or affirmed that they weren't going to get into the protocol more accurately. And I remember that, and the entire COP was in the Maritime Hotel in Bonn, and all of civil society was in the balcony of the plenary room, the entirety of it. Now, it was a biz, it wasn't the full COP, but things have come a long way since then, and that was the first moment where the world had a choice to make. And the choice was, if the US is not actually in this with us formally, are we still willing to move forward? Are we still willing to progress as a global collective community? And they answered the question in the affirmative, and that was really a moment, and I remember the moment viscerally because the room erupted in standing ovation at the end, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that was going to be the direction. So fast forward 25 years, we've gone through this convulsion with the US ever since. We're in, we're out, we're in, we're out. I do think it's deeply unfortunate right now that we're out because US leadership actually does help. It does matter. Things do tend to progress at a faster pace, and we all know we're so far behind where we need to be in this challenge, and this challenge that is also an opportunity. And that brings us to Article 6. So Article 6, and Lisa, you can go into a lot more of the details on this, because she's the actual expert. I just slept at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Article 6 is really, I think of it as the on-ramp for private sector. But it's also, and IETA, which is the organization I used to be on the board of, I'm just recently off that board, did some studies, and the analysis that Lisa can get into a little bit more detail is it's profoundly impactful from a cost perspective, but also from an ambition and a getting us closer to being on track perspective. And when Article 6 is fully utilized, it's really important. So what is Article 6? Article 6 is the means by which countries can cooperate with each other to increase ambition through transferring of mitigation outcomes among them. And the hallmark of Article 6 is that there's no double counting, that there's transparency in what is being done, it's reported, but there's a lot of flexibility in Article 6 under 6.2, which is one of the subclauses, which really gives the sovereigns a lot of discretion to design things. And then there's another clause called 6.4, which is more of a centralized mechanism that will be administered by the Conference of the Parties, a supervisory body that's just been fully authorized after 9 years of negotiations. And the combination of those two, 6.2 and 6.4, work together to facilitate what we like to call carbon trading, but it's really cooperation using mitigation outcomes. There's another provision called 6.8 that is non-market mechanisms, and it shouldn't be overlooked. It's important. There's all kinds of ways to channel financing that don't necessarily involve quote unquote a market mechanism. So that's where we are. I mean, Article 6 was ensconced at the Paris Agreement, okay? And that was a long time ago. It was 9 years ago, and it's taken a long time. And the reason I would say, this gentleman named Rob Bradley, some of us may remember him or know him still, he said something one time that just crystallized this whole issue of carbon, climate, and particularly carbon trading and the challenge. He said, it's too political for the technicians, and it's too technical for the politicians. And that's really encapsulates the challenge that Article 6 has represented for the last 9 years. But I want to say that I really feel we're at a moment now, having gotten through the Baku COP, and we have now the job, the responsibility to sort of start to implement these mechanisms in a responsible way that can really lead to a really positive outcome and a lot of opportunity as we address the climate challenge. So maybe I'll stop there. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Great segue to Lisa. Lisa DeMarco is the CEO at Resilient LLP, fellow Canadian. And we were both burning the midnight oil at COP29 in Baku, waiting for it to be gavelled through. Let's talk about that. What exactly was gavelled through in Baku, and why was it so contentious?
Yeah, a little bit of magic was gavelled through, both in terms of process and in terms of substance. And I like to use the number 76. It was actually 76 minutes between when the deal was dead, done, delegations were leaving the building, and when it was gavelled through as a decision. So some of the magic that happened as a function of a little bit of an unsung hero, John Podesta of the United States, who stuck his neck out and agreed to one extremely contentious issue pertaining to the mechanism registry and the use and connection between the mechanism registry and the international registry. And this was a long-standing 9-year issue for the US, and it took a little heroism to get that over and through the gavel, literally 76 minutes after it was dead. So 2 things happened that are of note. On the top down mechanism, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, as Rick said, set out in Article 6.4, we finally got effectively the mechanism operationalized. And we did that by a bit of a sleight of hand. So always when Houdini does a trick, we're a little worried that somebody figures out what that trick is. And what happened was they couldn't get two aspects through the supervisory board. One was methodologies in general, getting them approved from the old CDM into the new mechanism and the process within the new mechanism. And the second was in relation to removals themselves. They're just so contentious, particularly in relation to nature-based removals. So they need approval to get that done in general, unless it's a standard or a guidance document. So somehow, between the last supervisory body and in the first day of the COP, these very contentious decisions that should have had approval of the COP got labeled standards and got just passed through, so the COP just took note of them. So that could come back to bite us, but it got done from that perspective. And then on the other mechanism, the bilateral trading mechanism, through which many of those Article 6.4 credits need to be traded, we finally got the I's dotted and the T's crossed on how you go about authorizing the use of those credits predominantly, the cooperative approaches themselves, and the entities, those of us who trade in the market, who participate in it, and details around the reporting, record keeping, sequencing, and timing of how that gets done. And believe it or not, those details were actually holding back a number of transactions from happening because there was uncertainty associated with that. So that's at a really high level, the two big issues that got decided, but with a little bit of magic, a little bit of a sleight of hand that could be problematic in 2028. Got a vacation for 3 years. We're not going to look at these decisions for 3 years, but when we come back to it, we think there could be some procedural challenges with how things were done. But for now, full steam ahead.
I do want to ask quickly, you said that the provision that the COP took note of could come back to bite us. What would that look like? Yeah, can you elaborate the challenge there a little bit?
Yeah, it's kind of like opening a Pandora's box. Once you change what should have been an approved decision into merely a standard that needed to be taken note of, it's very possible that other decisions that need approval that are not helpful to markets could get taken note of in the same way. And similarly, it's open to procedural challenge at future COPs that this was not done in a procedurally correct manner. So in the US, you'd call that due process. In the Canadian context, we'd call it procedural fairness, or the rules of natural justice were not respected. And you can expect some toing and froing when it's politically convenient. I love that expression. Too political for the technicians, too technical for the politicians. Exactly. You can expect that if it gets political, this might come back to just be a little issue. But we're good with issues. We solve many of them, right? Happens regularly.
I think this is a good time to chat about the market outlook. It's, you know, we're really in on the details and thinking about, obviously we have our lawyers on stage, what the process and what has truly been agreed on at Article 6, but from the markets, yeah, how are folks feeling about what was gavelled through? Who is developing projects to be eligible under Article 6, and what does the outlook look like? And before I jump in, I do have to introduce who's going to be answering our question. Alex Rao, he's a founding partner at ECP and Up Energy Group. So Alex, please go for it.
Yeah, thanks, and it's great also to be here to join the panel, and to Rick and Lisa and I have known each other for almost 20 years at this point now. So worked very closely historically with Rick and now also with Lisa. So it's good to join you both on the panel here. Briefly, yes, I have a couple of different hats I wear. So I'm one of the partners of an investment firm in California called Environmental Commodity Partners, but we are active both in trading in the allowance markets and the compliance markets, but also financing projects and sponsoring development of projects overseas. And so from that perspective, hopefully I can share some inputs on what investors are looking for, what the outlook may be on prices, at least at this stage looks like today. And I think generally we're pretty constructive and pretty pleased with where we are, given the number of ways this could have gone differently in the last 24 plus months. So I also am one of the founders and still a board member and pretty active with a company called Up Energy Group, which is now probably one of the largest developers of household device carbon projects, primarily in East Africa. So clean cooking, safe water systems, and some other project types that essentially come around a distribution-based business model that Up Energy Group and some of its peers, companies like Burn and other manufacturers or distributors of these household devices, have developed distribution networks in countries like Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, and so forth, where we're actually manufacturing clean cook stoves, electric cook stoves, all the way through to safe water systems, installing them in households, in community centers, and institutional safe water systems, and then as a part of that, using the value of the carbon credits that we can generate, both historically under the old Kyoto frameworks, under voluntary frameworks, and then now very optimistically under Article 6. Essentially using that value, pulling it forward to subsidize the value of these products that are then ultimately sold on to communities for use, and that's where the emission reductions happen. So can speak with a little bit of experience around the project developer's role, what the outlooks are, how we're seeing things like authorizations, what does that process look like, what are the methodologies? These are the questions now that it's exciting to actually have to tackle technical questions that are still have that political layer behind them ever present. But from my point of view, I think it is optimistic that we are moving into a bit more of the technical or the procedural, the executional phase of Article 6, both for 6.2 and 6.4, and that's really positive. So a couple of basic frameworks I would have, is as I've started, actually just one quick comment to both what Rick and Lisa had said before. So I started in 2001 in this industry in the UK, right after the Marrakesh Accords, which essentially were the equivalent to me of what Baku did for 6.2 and 6.4. Maybe a bit caricature to say this, but it is that starting gun and a bit of technical procedural guidance that allows a lot of the details now to come into shape that we would want to develop projects, to invest in projects, to trade instruments, and so forth. So 2001 was also, as Rick mentioned, that was the same time that Bush W pulled us out, the US out of Kyoto. So it's the same inflection point, US leaving the global treaties, but then you get the rulebook actually in place. So operationalization essentially happens at the same time the US pulls out. So we've seen this playbook before. We'll come back to it, I'm sure, on the role of the US, but especially as an American, Rick as well, I mean, we've both spent our careers mostly in the overseas mechanisms. And so we're here again, and it's unfortunate that this is the case at the politics, but that's our country. That's the way, it goes. And let's see what happens in the next 4 years. So, but in terms of market specific outlook, looking fairly constructive, both from an investor's point of view and a developer's point of view. I think what you see in Article 6, both pathways, 6.2 and the PACM, now what was 6.4 before, or what still is, but is now rebranded. I think you are seeing multiple avenues to demand. You are seeing the elements of what we have long been missing in the last decade, probably, which is outside of pockets like California or Australia or Alberta, you're seeing a compliance-like program on the project side. So not just allowances, trading the same EUA back and forth, not a lot you can do there. It has its function, cold issue. But in a much more tangible way to incentivize and give what, I think the hope here is that there's a global bid on abatement and removals. So let's call it that way, but really focusing still on abatement right now. So anywhere you are on the planet, in theory, if you can do something to reduce, avoid, or remove emissions, there is some tangible value. There's some intrinsic value to that now. You still have to monetize it. You still have to be on the right side of procedural mechanisms. You have to be You have to execute all of these things, but at least there is this theoretical, finally now, global bid on abatement. We didn't have it under Kyoto. We had pockets of the CDM countries that were essentially net beneficiaries, but you had huge parts of the world that were out of that, and of course the US is going to be out of Paris for a few years, so that there's echoes there. But for the most part, you have a universal opportunity to reduce emissions, connect to a financial value to it, make investment decisions, make operational decisions, and execute on this project. So that's really, really profound. We haven't been operating in that environment until Baku, I would say, or at least in the last 10 years or so. So that's very constructive. I think from a developer who has been operating under the previous regimes or in certain voluntary methodologies, there is already enough guidance to go forth and start developing projects, especially if we're talking about assets, fixed assets, something like a landfill gas project or something it goes through a project financing cycle. These abatement projects, generally you would anticipate 18, 24 months on the earliest from a development lead out time. There's so much that you all know that goes into it, from planning permits through to engineering feasibility studies, financing, and so forth. All of that essentially is a timeline on implementation that can match now with the timelines that we think are ahead for taking now your carbon value and running it through 6.2 or 6.4. So 2 to 3 years, if there's a pathway to defined commodity grade demand, and we put a pin in that because it's clearly not going to be just a commodity. There's going to be variation and diversity under these two mechanisms. But there's a compliance bid out there to a certain extent, 2 to 3 years time, that you can be confident in. You still have to run your S&Ds. You have to say, is this market going to be oversupplied? Where are the demand pockets? Is it CORSIA? Is it NDC-driven demand? Is it voluntary demand that is moving through an authorized process to therefore avoid questions about double counting? There's a lot of questions still in there, but at least you see the timelines are there. And for early movers, there's enough roadmap to demand at this point that people should be starting to develop projects. Financing is a little bit different of an equation because financing now you're starting to take a little bit more direct exposure. There's different ways you can do it. The closer you can align with the developer, the more de-risked you will be in the sense that you're able to manage some of the volatility, some of the mechanism uncertainties that are still out there and sort of pitfalls, whether it's methodologies that may change, verifiers, how to get access to the right kind of components of the carbon project lifecycle. But we still see enough of a pathway there that there's plenty of demand now, I think, waiting in that 2 to 3 years out time frame. So near term, of course, prices are trying to we're in a period of price discovery to try to see what is the value in the near term for Paris Agreement instruments. Where are we today? We're probably back to very, very basic heuristics, rules of thumb, right? So voluntary value, if you call it pure voluntary value somewhere, has always been, or pre-compliance value has always been, roughly speaking, $5 a ton. I mean, there's various reasons for that. But if you take that as a base, that you're generating high quality abatement that hasn't moved through some kind of a certification process yet, you're talking about a single digit carbon price right now. And as you start to move through, you can upgrade that value. So what are the few things you can do? Clearly, if you get through one of the pathways to market with your instruments and you can get authorizations, so you now have a Paris instrument, you're probably looking at $5 to $10 a ton, maybe a little bit more. And then the next level up right now would be something like you are CORSIA compliant. So on top of that, so that's not just because you're Article 6 compliant does not inherently mean you're CORSIA compliant and vice versa. So right now, I think it's still the likely outlook that the CORSIA bucket of demand for Article 6 instruments is probably the most well-defined. It's probably also something that we're getting stronger price signals on, and whether you're looking to like the ICE contract that gives you some window based on limited open interest and trading activity, but has been relatively stable, expressing value at a 15, maybe at the upper end, where we understand some of the art trees types instruments trade in the low 20s. So that's kind of your rule of thumb. There's nothing more advanced than that at this point, but we'll see trading volumes start to pick up. Volumes confirm price, in my view, so we really need to see trading volumes pick up to understand what's the depth there. How much depth is there to that demand that then an investor or a project developer can say, now I can have confidence to pencil out the next level of project that has an abatement cost outlook. So to summarize, I think very constructive, a lot of questions. The questions now are more technical and procedural in nature, and those do determine value and price, but the overall framework looks very constructive.
I want to take it back to the discussion of where we are in the US. Obviously, the US played a significant role in getting Article 6 through the door, but now no longer being a party in the Paris Agreement, folks are wondering, what is the role of the US moving forward?
Annexation of our neighbors.
On that topic, I thought I'd
Oh, yeah.
I gotta look at it first.
Not for sale.
Canada is not for sale. Okay, I'm in. I'm all in.
Better you're
I'm
wearing
all
it.
in. There we go. I love it. I love this hat. Can I actually have this hat?
It's yours.
Oh my God,
Just
that's
for you.
awesome. I am gonna proudly wear this. This is amazing. Thank
It'll
you.
help you get
Do you know
across
what
the border.
1867 is?
I don't even know.
1867, something post-Civil War.
1867. I am old, Lisa, but I'm not that old.
It's the year Canada was formed.
I imagine.
Canada.
Following
Thank
just a
you.
war with our neighbors. You know?
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
I was joking. One day, I don't know, I walked into the grocery store. We had Canadian flags on everything. And it's, bizarre. I got to get one of those hats for
Got one
myself.
That's fantastic. Serious,
Yes,
to bring it back, I mean, we kind of started with this point. We've been here before in a way. But I think we would be doing a disservice to the gravity of where we are to just assume that the way that the world's going to react to this and the way that we all need to react to this ourselves and in our communities and in our professions and so forth is just to go back to what we did the last time. Because as is evident to everybody, this is not the last time. And, it's not just an absence of participation. It's a very aggressive intention to destroy a lot of different things, many of which I personally think are what is good in this world. And it's deeply disturbing and deeply troubling. So we gotta take a deep breath and recognize that this is a fight. We're not powerless. I think we have more power collectively than maybe we think we do. But I don't know that we aren't psychologically, I haven't been, and I don't get a sense that the world was prepared for this. And let's not forget, we're basically 3 months in.
Yeah.
3 months. And so, look, I'm still processing it myself, but I do believe that in the work we do around the world in many of the countries where you have operations and stuff, there's a lot of overlap there, it's pretty interesting. We do capacity building for the governments that are putting their Article 6 frameworks and institutional arrangements in place. And there is a genuine commitment and a genuine enthusiasm. And the US is in or out, if you're in Southeast Asia, it's just not that relevant of a topic, honestly. There are people that are doing this and motivated to do it that don't rely on the United States, and they don't ask the United States for permission, and they're not thinking about the United States. And there's a big world out there outside the United States. So that's the positive and that's the reality, but boy, it sure helps when the United States is actually leading for good and, using its vast economic power and so forth in the right way. And we're not there. We're not just, it's not just an absence, it's an affirmative, aggressive attack on all things that, I cherish. And so that's different. That's different. But the point is do the deals, get going, find other sources of funding. Let's not rely on the federal government. We really, truly haven't been able to rely on the federal government for the last 25 years. Let's be honest about it, right? And subnationals are going to pick up the slack. You know, they're a little bit less vocal about it than they were last time. There's a little less sort of, oh, well, the cavalry's all assembled and it's no big deal. But there are a lot of things happening in prep for Belém, the next COP, related to, you know, we're all in, and the news reports of Governor Newsom just joining, you know, a few days ago are helpful. And, you know, Governor Pritzker from Illinois, great governor, I'm from Chicago. You know, there is an infrastructure that is ready to be mobilized, but we haven't quite seen kind of that anxiety-reducing kind of counter-response yet. And I think, you know, we have to wait and see on that one. So I maybe just offer other people their reflections.
I mean, I can give just quick views on, for Article 6 itself, what is the U.S.'s dropping out of Paris suggest, or maybe for carbon markets more broadly. I mean, it does. I definitely agree with Rick in terms of this is new in terms of this particular aggressive approach that we're going to have to fight through in their own language. But if you look at it from supply-demand point of view, what does it mean for the U.S. to exit the Paris Agreement? Not a whole lot, frankly. We have both been on the sidelines, of course, from federal domestic action, so there hasn't been much of a federal conversation, as everyone here knows very well. You know, even the previous administration seemed nowhere near getting any operational focus on LOAs for U.S. projects, you know, enabling our project development community to interface with Article 6 in a constructive way. So clearly there wasn't a lot of time, operationalization hadn't happened yet. So, but it wasn't like there was a lot happening anyway in the U.S. with respect to Article 6. There are private companies that are certainly active and very interested. From the supply question, it's very clear to me now that I make an assumption here that the whole structure of the Paris Agreement for those countries that are in means that supply has to go through the Paris structure one way or another. That's the letters of authorization, that's the kind of the accounting structures and frameworks of the Paris Agreement. So I do think that is the case, and I do think over time a developer has to, if you're outside of the US or North America, you have to really be now looking at 6.2 or 6.4. You know, yes, there is voluntary demand that will continue, and in fact, I think what happens is voluntary demand consolidates to the U.S. now for those U.S. corporates that want to progress those subnational activities here. But that, you know, that's likely. It's clearly the U.S. supply, if there were to be supply from the U.S. at scale, is not going to go through the Paris mechanism. So if the supply side is clear, it's the U.S., rest of the world. And there's two different pathways. The US pathway can only be voluntary now, at least for the next few years. For the demand side, it's roughly the same thing, right? So clearly anyone who's doing things in a Corsia capacity on the demand side or for NDC compliance, you already are going through the Paris structures anyway. So that's clear. So supply and demand have to clear in the rest of the world through the Paris Agreement. I don't see that much latitude. I'm curious about the other panelists, because if you correct me, you guys see a lot of things that might modify some of that views, but it's, you know, it's roughly speaking, it's directionally correct. And then therefore, U.S. demand will have to go through the Paris structure if it wants to meet supply internationally, and maybe that's what will happen. That's that third bucket to me of, you don't make Corsia, you're not trying to get to an NDC as a supplier or a developer, you're trying to get to the voluntary market, but you're still gonna have to go through the accounting mechanism if you're in the rest of the world. Otherwise, I just think it's just gonna get too complex. If you're out of NDCs, yes. If you're in something like blue carbon, you know, that has a different framework, new project types maybe, but, you know, large scale abatement that's deployable today has to go through the Paris mechanism on the supply side.
So let me just take a riff off of that and then turn it to you, Lisa, if it's okay, because it relates to the sort of the nature of the LOA, what's in the LOA, and you're really deep on that. But like at the country level, I totally agree with you. And what you're seeing is the domestic regulations in some of the early markets that are implementing the Article 6 domestic authorization processes are saying to themselves, okay, we've had voluntary projects in our country operating, and there's been no visibility, there's been no understanding of what's coming in, where the cash is coming, how many credits are being sold, et cetera. So that's operated, the voluntary market at the project level is largely operated historically completely independent from government oversight, regulation, even visibility. And so what a lot of the governments have been doing is saying, okay, well, we need to know what's happening in our country and what projects are there, who they are, what their intentions are. And then as a part of that, which goes back to your pointing everything flowing through, we will then have a process to decide if we quote unquote authorize that activity for 6.2 corresponding adjustment treatment, or approve it, small a, and recognize it, but just not authorize it. And in many cases, I don't think the project developers will necessarily even request authorization. Right now, everybody wants it if they can get it, but then it's going to come down to, well, in some jurisdictions, they're adding an additional corresponding adjustment fee. So you can get an approval for a voluntary or verified credit that's not authorized, but if you want an authorization, you got to pay extra to the government. So that already puts additional price differentiation there. And so depending on who you're selling to and what the pricing is, you got to balance that, right? But that's okay like that. So I see, just taking your point, that's running through the PARA system to me, even if you don't get an authorization from the government. And the difference is, if the government doesn't authorize it, they can use the emission reductions from that activity in their reporting of compliance under the Paris Agreement. If the government authorizes it, they are saying, you have all of those emission reduction or removal activity rights, and when we transfer them, we have to actually, on our reporting, add those tons as if they have been added to our ledger once they've left, because we can't double count them. So I think it's going to be a really interesting kind of mix of judgments and considerations and opportunities to think about how do you, as a private sector actor, align with government, but in a way that is facilitative of the government's achieving their Paris targets, but also, meeting the market demand for things that might require adjustments. And you can think about all different ways to structure transactions where there's a time-bound issue. Oh, we'll get, adjustments for some amount until the X date, and then you have the emission reductions for the later years, whatever. There could be all kinds of ways to structure, and that's exciting and fun for geeky lawyers, but.
Yeah, Lisa, please.
Speaking of geeking lawyers, there you go. Let me break down in 3 buckets. The first is all along the authorization line. The first is in relation to what gets authorized as a cooperative approach. Cooperative approach, by definition, has to be between 2 parties. US is no longer a party, so they can't authorize. So what you're going to see is for US active entities, and there are many, you're going to see a flurry of US expat carbon refugees getting effectively incorporated in jurisdictions that can authorize them. The second element is you authorize the ITMO itself for 2 purposes. The one is for authorized for use towards an NDC, authorized for use towards other international mitigation purposes. Again, you're going to be seeing entities looking for non-US related forms of authorization pathways for ITMOs. And because the US no longer has an NDC, you'll see them playing much more in the other international mitigation purpose world, so predominantly CORSIA. The third element is the entities. So the corporates that are playing, the ECPs of this world, need to get authorized if you want to play in the Article 6 international transaction world. And again, you have to be very careful about trying to authorize a US-based entity, so a lot of those expats. The path that Rick is talking about is a choice not to authorize and create something called a mitigation contribution unit. You're going to have a heck of a time trying to count that on your balance sheet if you're a corporate disclosing. So creative ways for good lawyers like Rick to come up with how do we actually invest in a mitigation contribution unit and still get to use it towards our US financially regulated corporate sustainability reporting
Yeah.
is going to be
That's
an interesting
Yeah.
line of work.
Yeah. Just one point to add on to that. So, I mean, U.S. entities needing authorization to participate, but this is not unfamiliar either. This is the structure, again, under Kyoto. So lots of U.S. entities were active in CDM. How did you do it? You had to have that U.S. entity to purchase the credits to be a project participant or to be a focal point. These kind of the old kind of Kyoto structures for the modalities of communication. You had to go through a party, and so we, as a U.S. entity historically active under CDM, would either be a U.S. entity or maybe it's an investment fund that's something like a Cayman entity that also is not really a viable pathway. So you saw the emergence of jurisdictions like the UK, which I'm optimistic they may play a similar role going forward, authorizing parties that are outside of their territory, but to come through their approval status. Of course, it was simpler under Kyoto because it was essentially not, there were not questions about compatibility with the NDCs really at that point. So this is a more complex situation, but.
In fact, we used to go jurisdiction hunting. Sweden used to be a good one. Phonom, we'd be able to get the actual authorizations from them. But if you look at what was in those authorizations, single page, not too complicated, you enter into a little power of attorney structure if you needed to take some security. Currently, what is required, consistency with the NDC. There's a whole chart in the annex of the decision. It's not a slam dunk. It's pretty complicated stuff, and it's tied very much into local compliance with an entity's Paris obligations. Really fundamental stuff. Their low emission development strategy, their NDC, their associated energy decrease in emission intensity. All of these things get looked at pretty carefully. So we're going to see some more shopping, some more jurisdiction shopping.
Sure, jurisdictional shopping, yeah.
Can I just make a comment on the shopping? And I don't want to be like, I'm a big fan of markets, and I'm a big fan of private entrepreneurs and innovators that go to hard places and try to do good things in those hard places. So, but there are a lot of what's the way to say it? Opportunistic early first movers who are trying to, in the absence of real clarity, and particularly with the governments themselves in these locations, kind of negotiate these deals and try to lock up kind of LOAs, and they're not even sure what they're going to use them for, but they just know that there's value there. So let's just get LOAs from the government, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and that's a natural phenomenon, and I'm not like overly critical about that, but I do think when you step back a bit, I mean, process does matter, and we all have to make sure that like what we're doing will look good and will sort of age well over the next 5 to 10 years, and not be viewed as an example of leverage or information arbitrage or some sort of taking advantage of a dynamic that's highly complex and highly disparate when it comes to the level of negotiating leverage in different places around the world. So all I want to say is just a caution to say it's worth considering, really thinking about the process as Lisa was articulating, and thinking about not just what's the best deal I can get right now today, but what's the best deal that in 5 years from now I'll still be proud to stand on a stage and describe and talk to people about. And that to me is a litmus test.
Can I just, an anecdote on that point. Walking through the hallways of the COP in Baku, if I closed my eyes and didn't look at the sign of a pavilion, I would have sworn it was the US pavilion from 15 years ago, promoting procedures, promoting markets for emission reductions, promoting the actual trading and transaction of emission reductions at scale. What was that pavilion? China.
Yeah, yeah.
Shocking to me. Shocking to me. All of the market platforms, huge display, all kinds of market programs going on. So I'm watching them. I'm watching them pretty
I
carefully.
was just going to ask about capacity building, right? I did a story where I spoke with USAID folks who said that with the funding freeze, the US is no longer doing this capacity building for carbon markets. I do want to open it to the audience for questions, but that'll be my last question.
I want us to start crying now.
Well, all right, I'm going to give you a quick war story. Old war horse talking about old war stories. So there I was. No, the week of January 20th, I was in Jakarta with USAID on a capacity building mission. And we had wonderful meetings, and the beginning of the week was amazing. But there was a question from everybody that we were meeting with. Well, what about Trump? The answer from USAID leads was very affirmative. Well, the money's been allocated, you know. By the end of the week, day after, you could start to see the confidence in the responses to that question start to get a little bit less strong. And then, the wheels were falling off by the following weekend. So right then and there. And look, it's been a dramatic. There was a big client of ours, and we did a lot of work with USAID, and it's really deeply disturbing that it could be just summarily terminated without, in my estimation, a legal process to do that. But the damage is done. You know, the lawsuits are there, and frankly, they're now processing payments. You know, they've hired some people back and so forth and so on because the courts mandated that they do these things. Damage is done. And it's but there are a lot of other countries out there and a lot of other institutions that are very focused on capacity building, and the World Bank and a lot of the Nordic countries and the UK and Germany and so forth. They are very actively focused on it. But the US was playing a really good role there, and it's a shame. So it's going to have to be backfilled, and the needs are great. And I feel like it's going to take some time to kind of reconstitute that capacity building architecture, but it'll come back.
Yeah. Only thing to add on capacity building is, so what is, from the developer or the market's role, what are we missing when we don't have it right now in a concerted way with the resources behind it? Largely, it is this confusion on what to do, in particular on the part of the local host country governments. So their procedures are secondary to domestic considerations or their considerations on how they're going to formulate their NDC commitments. And so there's a lot of uncertainty right now we see in some of our jurisdictions, and this is Up Energy and other developers I'm sure have this question, is that we want to get an authorization, and I agree there may be an LOA fetish at the moment, but there's procedures for, there's even intermediate steps that, if you're a developer, the best thing is to start communicating with the government to awareness that, hey, this is who I am, this is my project, this is what I'm doing, even before you ask for an LOA, right? So you're just communicating to someone. Who are you communicating to? Is a big question. Yes, there's going to be diversity, right? The whole structure is that every country gets to determine for its own how to set up procedures and mechanisms and authorizations. So who do you talk to first message? And then, an ideal world progression is something like you have a formalized process where the intermediate step might be something like a letter of no objection is what we call it, where you've messaged to the government has done some initial evaluation, and it's like, you know what, that sounds like a good initiative. I'm not ready to authorize you, but I'm not going to block you or say, no, this is in my NDC right now, so I'm already claiming this. This awareness, that's kind of an ideal mid-step, and then it's the LOA. What is the authorization for different use cases, and then what are the final step even beyond that is what is the consequence for revocation of an authorization. And this is where the insurance contracts and discussions come in, and how does that conform to what then someone can insure so that then you can get the Corsia label and you can now sell at the higher price. All this, so the procedural questions there Right now, for the most part, there's some very sophisticated countries that are, Kenya is very advanced in its thinking, Senegal, some other countries, but there are many countries that are just understandably behind the curve, and they need to first figure out what their priorities are. That's the domain where capacity building efforts would really pay dividends. It's not really something that the project developers, the market community can do themselves. They can, and we do that because there's a vacuum and you need to progress anyway, but we're not set up to do that. There's all sorts of positive externalities that come from that engagement, which a private company is maybe in a position to amortize or not. So this is where the capacity building really comes into play. It advances the overall market structure. Yep. And that's what we're missing.
And we have precedent for this. Like if you just imagine that carbon is a natural resource, like copper or oil, and a country's just discovered, oh my gosh, I'm sitting on an amazing copper resource underground. I've got to figure out my concession structure, my royalty structure, how this is traded internationally, how we actually grant any of those associated rights to it. This is where we're at in carbon. So we have precedents. We can do this, but it takes a while and you have to work super closely with the government. I know you probably want to get to
yes,
questions.
Please,
sorry.
Audience questions. We covered quite a bit of ground there, and we have a mic going around, so please just raise your hand and introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judith E. Clay from the California Public Utilities Commission, and just one of the programs which truly was kind of capacity building in the energy markets was the National Association of Utility Regulatory Commissions had a 20-year program with AID where they sent utility commission staff across, talking about market structures and interconnections and all sorts of things, energy, water, whatever. But that's not my question. just a little mourning. So I'm just curious if OPIC or Exim Bank played any roles in these markets, and if there's a change in the roles that they may play.
That's a great question. Really quickly, yeah, I mean, so what's now DFC for the time being? I haven't checked my phone in the last 45 minutes. Yes, and they've been very, very helpful in a lot of ways. So they would do products that would provide principal protection guarantees for like roughly 50% of a loan that would be issued in connection with activities that are the activities we're kind of talking about. So there were companies that built businesses and raised funds, and a big part of unlocking that capital was to provide those guarantees from DFC, for example. And they're out and supporting and wanting to do, they're looking for deals, they're looking to support. It really helps unlock. I mean, it's basically, concessionary capital along the lines of what Alex is talking about, because, it's really hard for a private company that has investors and you have a cost structure to sort of say, yeah, we're eventually going to make money, but we need to spend 2 years doing, deep dive technical assistance before we have the ability to have anything commercialized. It's just not how investors are conditioned to go along with that. So yeah, the DFC stuff is helpful, mitigating risk and then providing technical assistance, windows and so forth.
And in addition to OPIC, MEGA's got an insurance product out there.
Yeah. And you see variations of that with other countries and their mechanisms. So, and part of that may even go one step further. Like if you look at the JCM in Japan, with an explicit policy tool to incentivize Japanese technology providers or companies to export their technologies to reduce emissions, generate credits, and then be able to come back into that market. So there's a full diversity of these kind of public support mechanisms that are private sector enabled.
Great. Let's try these last 2 questions here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Javier Castro from the International Association of BBBs. I have a practical technical question. The corresponding adjustments means to correct the national inventory based on the specific activity cost. So it's a national inventory methodology that has to be used because you are correcting the national inventory. But at the same time, the projects are using project methodologies, which the results are, in, I assume, 99% of the cases different than the national inventory. How it is expected that this is going to be solved or clarified?
There's actually guidance in the Baku, well, first of all, it was in the 18.1, CMA 118, which CMA 1 was,
She's looking at me like I know.
yeah, there was guidance in.
It was in the LDocs of the.
You go ahead. Sorry.
There's guidance in how precisely it's done in terms of reconciling all forms of accounting, particularly in the first crop of NDCs, because there were trajectories, there were fixed numbers, there were project numbers, there were renewables targets, and there's guidance specifically in how that's done. And that played through into the Baku decisions, where you have to go back and in that reporting of the initial report, tie it back to how it's done. So there are methodologies. Kelly Kazire was really fundamental in a lot of those, in how precisely you do that. Very complicated. And every 2 years, countries present their biennial transparency reports and often get raked over the coals for how they've done it. I've been in the room where Canada's been raked over the coal pretty significantly about how it accounts for certain projects related to its forest sinks. So it's not a slam dunk, but there is a process for how it's done, and there are extraordinarily detailed guidance documents in 18 CMA1.
Can I just, I know we're at time. Can I just add something? Because I mean, she's got the actual answer. I've got the sort of philosophical point I want to make. You're just articulating something that's really important that I think goes underappreciated. So for those of us in the nature-based solutions world that have been trying to, work in this space, there's been this huge controversy / evolution of project-based versus national, jurisdictional, and then nesting. So how do you nest? What are the project level baselines with the national baselines and so forth? And so those that have been spending time in the nature-based solutions realm, laboring over this and thinking, gosh, we're sort of at the kiddie table. We're not, we're special in a not a great way because it's more complicated and we have to do all this extra stuff. Guess what? What you just described is basically nesting for every activity in all sectors in each country. And people haven't really come around to that. They still think, oh, well, for nature, it's really, really something, unique and special and different. So we have to spend more time and effort and more rules and whatever. Everything's nested now. So.
Yeah. I mean, you're seeing this live with the clean cooking sector too, in places, in particular in Africa, where there's understandably a lot of pressure on the questions like what is your percentage of non-renewable biomass that leads directly into accrediting calculation in various methodologies. That's where a lot of the divergence in methodologies around household devices is coming in. But to your point, the countries will have their own methodologies for their own NDC reporting. So take even clean cooking. If you have a private developer that's operating and say in a place like Ghana and has offtake agreements 6.2 with other countries, those other countries may come to in the 6.2 process to an agreement on an FNRB number, which may be very different than what the FNRB number that in the country in inventory, if at all, if cooking is even in the NDC. So this is the richness of Paris versus the Kyoto framework, where you didn't have that calculus even in Kyoto. And so all the voluntary market, anything project-based, its DNA is originally in unilateral crediting, not in that dual level kind of compatibility. So I think what you're describing is a feature of the Paris Agreement, and there's going to be rich dynamics in those too. Clean cooking, if someone is transferring a 30% FNRB, but the country thinks it's 70% and can justifiably, it has the sovereign decision to make that decision, what about the 40% difference? Maybe they keep that and credit that against their NDC, and the project still exports under 6.2 a lower. Who knows? I'm not advocating for that. That is just an artifact that can come out of this, and that's where a lot of the richness will be of Paris. So.
I think that unfortunately that's all we have time for. I'm sure we could spend a whole day doing a full day long workshop on Article 6. But please, if you have any questions, come find the panelists once we're all off the stage. And thank you so much for such a fantastic discussion. Really, truly, the decades of experience shows.
Old.